Hey guys, hope you're having a good Monday. I posted lesson plans for this week. Thank goodness it's almost spring break, so you'll get a week next week with no lessons to do online. Hopefully, maybe our quarantine won't last too much longer so we can get back to school and try to resume normal activities. Uh, I don't know about you all, but for me, this has been kind of rough. Uh, and what makes it even rougher is that people think, oh, you got a vacation, you're out of school, you're getting an extra month of vacation. And what they don't realize is that just because we're at home doesn't mean we're not working. Now, does it? Uh, I have worked harder having to put all this information and stuff online and help you guys learn it online than I would have if we'd been at school. Um, so it's definitely not a vacation like so many people think. Uh, So, anyway, make sure that you have taken your Chapter 11 quiz if you haven't done that yet. We're just going to spend a couple days on Chapter 12. We're looking at the spinal cord and the somatic nerves. Now, we're not going to learn a lot of the somatic nerves, but we are going to learn a lot about the spinal cord. Now, this information, we talked a little bit about the spinal cord in our last chapter, in Chapter uh, 11, when we talked about how the brain has gray matter on the outside with white matter on the inside, and we said that the spinal cord has white matter on the outside with gray matter on the inside. So a little bit they're kind of the opposite as far as where the white matter and the gray matter are. So we're going to learn a lot more about the spinal cord. You're going to get to learn about all the different parts of that gray matter and white matter that are in the spinal cord. And we're also going to learn about the spinal nerves and how they form and how they branch off the spinal cord and what information they carry. As I said, we're not going to learn a lot about all the different spinal nerves as far as names and all the different nerves that branch off those spinal nerves. You can save that for medical school if you end up going to medical school or even nursing school. We're going to just kind of hit the highlights as far as we're going to talk a lot about the spinal cord and a little about the spinal nerves. Okay, so let's go ahead and get this up here. Your spinal cord does not extend the length of your spinal column, or I should say your vertebral column. It is shorter. It goes from the foramen magnum, which remember is the opening where the spinal cord goes through to connect to your brain. So it extends from basically the base of your brain to the second lumbar vertebra. So again, it doesn't go all the way down to the coccyx. Your spinal cord is segmented, and again, it does have the similar segments, similar names as those that we use for the vertebral column. And these segments of the spinal cord are named for the portion of the vertebral column where the nerves that are branching off the cord enter and exit as far as those bones. So remember, we have foramina. We have foramen or foramina in our vertebra where the spinal nerves enter and exit the spinal cord that is inside those vertebrae. And so these segments of the spinal cord are named for the vertebra through which the nerves that connect to that segment, through which those nerves enter and exit through those vertebrae. So, the segment of the spinal cord, for example, whose nerves are entering and exiting through the thoracic vertebra, well, then that segment that contains those nerves that enter and exit through the thoracic vertebra, that segment would be called the thoracic segment of the spinal cord. There are 31 pair of spinal nerves. We talked about that before. And each spinal nerve is composed of a bundle of axons, Schwann cells, which remember those are the glial cells that produce the myelin sheath around these axons outside of the central nervous system, so outside of the brain and spinal cord. And then it also contains connective tissue that connects everything together. Again, the spinal cord is not one length uniformly up and down. It actually starts out larger at the anterior, or I shouldn't say anterior, but superior end that's connected to the brain, and then it gets smaller as you come down inferiorly down the spinal cord. The reason for this, again, is that there's all kinds of nerves that are, if you could see it, it's like a twisted rope of nerves. And of course, they all end up coming together to connect to the brain. But as you come down, they branch off, as you can see here. So as those nerves branch off, so this nerve here doesn't come on down the spinal cord. It branches off here and goes out to the arms, and so on and so forth. So that by the time you get to the inferior portion of the spinal cord, it's pretty small because there's not a lot of nerves left, because a lot of them have branched off and left the cord as you go from superior to inferior end. So it does, the diameter does decrease as you go toward the inferior end. There are two enlargements on the spinal cord: the cervical enlargement and the lumbosacral enlargement. The cervical enlargement is going to be right around in here, again, here up close to your neck. You can see it's kind of larger here, and then it gets thinner, and then it gets larger again. Okay, so this enlargement area is called the cervical enlargement, and this is the area where nerves that supply your upper limbs are going to be branching off and entering into the spinal cord. And then the lumbosacral enlargement, you can see more down here. This is the area where you have spinal nerves that are entering and exiting that supply your lower limbs. At the very end of our spinal cord, we have a couple of structures that we want to talk about. The first one is the conus medullaris. So again, this little area right here, it is just the tapered end of the spinal cord that kind of, again, it's on the inferior end, and it kind of looks like a cone. So that's why it's called the conus medullaris. And then you can see all these little roots of spinal nerves branching off of that. That is called the cauda equina. The cauda equina basically looks kind of like a horse's tail, and so that's why it's called the cauda equina, equine for horse. It's basically just roots of spinal nerves that are extending inferiorly from the lumbosacral enlargement. So this is the lumbosacral enlargement. All these little roots of these spinal nerves extending off of it that form this kind of almost horsetail-like structure are called the cauda equina. Okay? Moving on, now we did talk about these last year in regular anatomy when we look at the spinal meninges and the spaces between those spinal meninges. Again, the meninges are connective tissue membranes that surround the spinal cord and brain, and they help to protect and nourish the spinal cord and the brain from superficial to deep. They are the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. So the pia mater is going to be the layer that is closest to the brain and spinal cord, and the dura mater is going to be the layer that is the furthest away from the brain and spinal cord. Again, dura mater is the thickest. Again, so it's going to be very protective. And that's why when I think of dura, I think of durable. So it's thick and protective, and it can withstand a lot. The arachnoid mater is going to be more thin, and it kind of looks like a spider web. And so that is the reason why the blood vessels in it kind of make it look like a spider web. So that's the reason why it's called arachnoid mater, because an arachnid is a spider. And then the pia mater, again, is going to be, again, this is dura, this is arachnoid, this is pia mater. The pia mater is going to be very thin. Remember, it's going to be more for nourishing the brain and spinal cord, and it is going to be bound very tightly to the surface of the brain and spinal cord, and it forms what we call the filum terminale. And basically, this is just it helps to limit the movement of the spinal cord. The filum terminale, it also forms the denticulate ligaments. Again, this right here shows you a little denticulate ligament. So the filum terminale, and I probably should highlight denticulate ligament as well. The filum terminale anchors the spinal cord to the coccyx, which is your tailbone, and keeps your conus medullaris from moving superiorly or upward. Okay, so it's just helping to limit the movement of your spinal cord, keep it from going too far up or superiorly. And then the denticulate ligaments, these little things right here, are attaching it to the dura mater. Remember, this is the dura mater. So the denticulate ligaments attach the spinal cord to the dura mater, and this prevents lateral movement or movement from side to side of the spinal cord, so that you're keeping your spinal cord pretty stable within those foramen in the vertebra. Keep it from moving around superiorly and laterally. And then, of course, remember we have spaces between these layers of spinal meninges. And we'll see these more or better in another picture here in just a minute. But the epidural space, remember, is epi, or outside or outer or above the dura mater. And it is going to contain lots of fat. It also has spinal nerve roots and blood vessels. This is where they actually inject when someone has an epidural. This is where they inject that anesthesia. The subdural space is below the dura mater, so it's going to be here in between the arachnoid mater and the dura mater, so it's right in here. The subdural means below the dura mater, and it has a little bit of fluid in it. And then the subarachnoid space is going to be between the pia and the arachnoid, so it's going to be right in here. And it has the cerebrospinal fluid. It also has blood vessels that, again, are probably, originating in that arachnoid mater, and that's why it's called arachnoid. Okay. So we can see them better here. Again, if we want to see superficial to deep, all the spaces and the spinal meninges, you just read this picture from right to left. So the epidural space is here, filled with lots of fat. Again, this is where they inject the anesthesia for an epidural. Again, it is the space between the vertebra and the dura mater. This is the epidural space. Then this little line is the dura mater. Then we have the subdural space right in here. You can see that little black line. Okay. And then the second little pink line here is the arachnoid mater. So you can see that subdural space, that little black line, is very small. Then you have the arachnoid mater. Then you have the subarachnoid space, which is a little bit bigger. You can see it here. And then we have these thicker yellow lines here. Or I'm not going to say thicker. The yellow lines are the actual nerves, the spinal nerves. But below that spinal nerve, right in there, you can see that's the pia mater is in there. That little pink space in there is the pia mater. So you have pia. Then you have your subarachnoid space, you have your arachnoid mater, you have your subdural space, you have your dura mater, and then you have your epidural space right here with all this fat in it. Okay, moving on. Now we want to look at the actual spinal cord. We want to look at a cross section of the spinal cord. I do have one of these. If we get to return to school, we can actually look at a model of it. But for right now, we're just going to have to look at diagrams again. Again, remember that the spinal cord has white matter on the outside with gray matter in the shape of a butterfly on the inside, and we'll look at that in a minute. You actually have a couple of deep clefts that kind of, not completely, but partially separate the left and right halves of the spinal cord. These are called the anterior median fissure on the front or the anterior side of the spinal cord, and then the posterior median sulcus on the back or posterior side of the spinal cord. Again, remember that white matter is white because it has myelinated axons, and it is actually divided. It isn't divided, but we divide it into three columns or funiculi called the ventral column, dorsal column, and lateral column. And each of these columns is divided into tracts. What is a tract? A tract is a collection of axons that are inside the central nervous system. Remember, a collection of axons outside the nervous system is called a nerve. Outside the central nervous system. So outside the brain and spinal cord, a collection of axons is called a nerve. In the brain and spinal cord, a collection of axons is called a tract or a nerve tract. The myelination of a tract in the CNS is different than nerves outside the CNS. And I'm not sure we'll talk about how it's different, but it is different. So I guess that's why they have different names. And then, of course, the gray matter, it contains the cell bodies of neurons as well as the dendrites, and it contains some axons as well. And we divide we divide the gray matter into three horns: the posterior or dorsal horn, which is smaller, the anterior or ventral horn, which is larger, and then the lateral horn, which is pretty small too. And the lateral horns are going to be associated with autonomic motor neurons. So it's going to be those neurons that innervate your autonomic nervous system, which, remember, that's responsible for involuntary things like regulating the heartbeat and controlling movement of smooth muscle. So the lateral horns are associated with the motor neurons of the digestive tract and cardiac muscle and things like that. Okay, so here we can see this is going to be our anterior median fissure. Again, this is the anterior side of the spinal cord. This is the posterior side, so this deep cleft is called the anterior median fissure, and then back here we have another one called the posterior median sulcus. We can also see here is our gray matter in the shape of a butterfly, and then all this pink around it is what we call the white matter. Again, the white matter we have divided into three columns. This part is the dorsal or posterior column. This part of the white matter is called the anterior or ventral column, and then here on each side we have what we call the lateral columns of white matter. So we call those columns. And then the gray matter is divided into horns. So we have the posterior horns or dorsal horns, which are going to be a lot smaller. The ventral horns are a lot larger, and then these little bumps here on the side, these are called the lateral horns. Again, that is the gray matter inside the spinal cord. Again, here you can see an actual cross-section through an actual spinal cord. You can see, again, the butterfly. This is the gray matter, and all this around it is the white matter. Again, here you have your dorsal column. Here's a lateral column, and this is the ventral column. Here we have our dorsal horn, which is smaller, ventral horn is bigger, and then lateral horns here kind of pooching out to the side a little bit. Okay, moving on. We also are going to talk about these things that are extending off of the spinal column here. You can see them here, these rootlets and then roots. And then we'll also talk about the commissure as well, which is here in the center. So the commissure is in the center of the gray matter and of the white matter, I should have there. It's in the center of the white and gray matter. You have a gray commissure and you have a white commissure. This contains axons that cross from one side of the spinal cord to the other. So axons are going to cross like this, and they're going to cross like this right here in this commissure. And this basically connects the left and right sides of the spinal cord together. Again, in this gray commissure here, we have this central canal, which helps with the circulation of cerebrospinal fluid within and around the spinal cord. And then we have this white commissure here as well. Again, this contains axons that are connecting the left and right sides of the spinal cord. The other thing we want to talk about are the roots. Spinal nerves actually come from 6 to 8 rootlets. So these little bitty things are called rootlets. They combine together to give us our spinal nerve. Notice we have rootlets that combine to give us these actual roots, and then these two roots combine together to give us the nerve. So rootlets give us roots, and then two roots give us a nerve, a spinal nerve. So the spinal nerve begins right here. We have a dorsal root and a ventral root. Again, this is going to be our dorsal root. This is the dorsal root ganglion, and then this is the ventral root. And then these two come together to give us a spinal nerve. Something that you need to remember is that the dorsal root contains sensory neurons. The ventral root contains motor neurons. And again, we see something here that we don't have with the ventral root. The dorsal root has this dorsal root ganglion. The dorsal root ganglion contains the cell bodies of those sensory neurons. Remember that most of our sensory neurons are unipolar. There's a few in our eye and our nose that are bipolar, but most of them are unipolar. So the sensory neurons, their cell bodies are right here in this dorsal root ganglion. And then remember, our motor neurons are multipolar. So that's what we're going to have here in this ventral root. So again, just looking at that picture again, we have the rootlets here. The rootlets converge to form the ventral root and the dorsal root, with that dorsal root ganglion containing those unipolar sensory neuron cell bodies, and then the dorsal and ventral roots converge together to form the spinal nerve. And you can see it a lot better in the illustration. You can see the spinal nerve here. You can see the ventral root and the dorsal root. The rootlets aren't quite as obvious in this actual picture as they are in the diagram. Okay, so again, just kind of going over what we just went over. The dorsal root ganglion contains the cell bodies, that's this right here, the cell bodies of the unipolar sensory neurons. These unipolar sensory neurons can do one of two things. One thing they can do is they can synapse with interneurons here in the spinal cord itself, or these unipolar sensory neurons can go on into the white matter, okay, like we're showing here, these arrows, and they can ascend or descend in the spinal cord. So they can either go up in the spinal cord or go down in the spinal cord. So that's three different things that these unipolar sensory neurons can do. They can synapse with interneurons in the spinal cord. They can ascend or descend up or down the spinal cord. Again, the ventral roots contain the axons of motor neurons. Again, we have the somatic motor neurons. Again, remember, somatic control our skeletal muscles are going to be in the ventral horn here, and that's going to be this purple line. And then in the lateral horn, we have the autonomic motor neurons. So again, basically, guys, what you're going to see here, and we're going to talk about this more in a minute, but you're going to have information coming in on these unipolar sensory neurons. Okay, that information can go up and down the spinal cord. It can go on up to the brain. And then that information can also go here to an interneuron. Okay, and then again, interneurons in the brain and spinal cord, this is where integration happens. This is where information is processed and the response is determined. So a stimulus, you have a stimulus, maybe you are getting close to a hot pot. That those unipolar sensory neurons send that information down this sensory neuron in this dorsal root. It synapses with an interneuron in the spinal cord. And then it is processed, it is integrated, and then the information is sent along motor neurons in the back out for a response. So in that case, one main thing that's going to happen is if you're about ready to touch a hot pot, then you're going to have information come along this somatic motor neuron to your skeletal muscle to get you to pull your arm away. I'm not sure the autonomic motor neuron here, that may go to your heart to speed your heart rate up because, that was really kind of put you in a fight or flight mode almost. So your heart rate may increase there as a result of that. So that's we call that a reflex arc, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So anyway, the axons for these motor neurons here are going to pass through that ventral root and on into the spinal nerve, going out to your skeletal muscles as well as your cardiac and smooth muscle, causing responses of those, also to your glands, to cause a response to whatever information, whatever stimulus you received that came along this sensory neuron. Okay, so again, very important here, and I think that this is an excellent diagram to help you with this. Dorsal roots. The dorsal root contains unipolar sensory neurons that synapse with interneurons in the brain and spinal cord here, obviously in the spinal cord. And then the ventral root contains the motor neurons. Again, somatic motor neurons coming from the ventral horn, autonomic motor neurons coming from the lateral horns here. Again, going out to innervate glands as well as cardiac and smooth muscle. Again, that's the blue line, that's the autonomic, and then the purple line here, that's the somatic, innervating your skeletal muscle, again, for a response. So what we see here is that our spinal nerve contains both sensory neurons and motor neurons. So spinal nerves actually carry information to the brain and spinal cord and away from the brain and spinal cord. Okay, the last thing that we want to look at today are reflexes. Remember, we talked about reflexes just a little bit in regular anatomy last year. We talked about what a reflex was and a little bit about what controlled it, but they're a lot more complicated than what we gave them credit for. Remember that a reflex is an automatic involuntary response to a stimulus. Again, it's involuntary, meaning that it occurs without conscious thought. And it is homeostatic. It can be homeostatic in that it is helping to maintain homeostasis internally. Autonomic reflexes help to maintain like your blood pressure inside your body, but you also have somatic reflexes that help to remove your body from painful stimuli to prevent tissue damage. So again, we do have some autonomic autonomic reflexes that are helping to regulate just conditions inside our body, and then we have somatic reflexes that and those are the ones that we're the most familiar with, that help to remove our body from something that might damage us. So I mentioned this a second ago. A reflex arc is a neural pathway that controls a reflex, and it is the basic functional unit of the nervous system. It is capable of receiving a stimulus and responding to that stimulus. And so again, just as we saw in this picture, so I keep going back to this picture again, we're going to have, and we'll look at it again in a minute, we're going to have a sensory receptor out here that's going to collect the information, the stimulus. It's going to send that stimulus along a sensory neuron to an interneuron, then to a motor neuron, to an effector organ, whether that be cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, or glands. So again, those are the components of a reflex arc. A sensory receptor could be in your skin, it could be in your eye, it could be in your nose, in your taste buds, in your ears. It receives a stimulus. That information is passed along a sensory neuron to an interneuron in the spinal cord in this case, and then the information for a response then goes along the motor neuron to an effector organ, such as skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or a gland. Again, we have two types of reflexes, monosynaptic and polysynaptic. Monosynaptic reflexes do not involve interneurons. So the information goes directly from a sensory neuron to a motor neuron in the spinal cord without synapsing with an interneuron. So that's why it's called monosynaptic. There's just one synapse, the synapse between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. With your polysynaptic, you have more than one synapse. You have a synapse of the sensory neuron with the interneuron, and then a synapse of the interneuron with the motor neuron. And again, you can have more than just those two synapses. You can have many interneurons and possibly many motor neurons being involved here. Okay, so again, the same picture we were just looking at, but now we have the sensory receptor and the effector organ. Again, a sensory receptor, in this case, we're showing one in the skin. Maybe we're feeling that hot pot. So the sensory receptors in the skin that detect hot and cold are going to send that stimulus along a spinal nerve down the dorsal root into to an interneuron in the spinal cord, and then that information gets passed along that somatic motor neuron from that ventral root back out the spinal nerve to our skeletal muscle to tell us to pull our hand away. Again, this is just showing the somatic motor neuron, that purple one. Remember, the blue one would be originating here in the lateral horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord, and that would be our blue line, and we could possibly have a blue line here going to our cardiac muscle that would cause our heart to speed up, because I'm guessing that if I touch a hot pot or almost touch a hot pot, my heart's probably going to increase. My heart rate will increase as well. Okay, so again, some reflexes are integrated within the spinal cord, others are integrated within the brain. The ones that we're going to talk about today are integrated within the spinal cord. Now, this doesn't mean that information doesn't go to the brain, but the information doesn't have to go all the way to the brain for a response. Because if you had to wait for information to go all the way to the brain for a response and then come back down to tell you to move your hand away from that hot pot, you would already be severely burned, because that would take a little bit longer because the distance of the information has to go further. So we have these reflexes that originate in our spinal cord that it's a lot faster because you don't have to wait for that information to get all the way up to the brain and then all the way back down. You know, the brain is going to be involved in that sensing that heat or sensing that pain from touching the hot pot, but your body doesn't have to wait for your brain to tell it what to do. It automatically happens. So it originates in the in the spinal cord, or we should say it's integrated. Integrated means interpreted and processed in the spinal cord. Okay, those are the ones that we're going to talk about today. Some of the information does go to the brain to allow us to feel it, or to allow us to feel the pain, but the response to that stimulus is integrated. It is processed, and the response is determined in the spinal cord. It doesn't have to go to the brain for a response. Some reflexes, and we'll talk about this today, involve excitatory neurons, some involve inhibitory neurons. So again, some can cause, for example, the contraction of skeletal muscle to remove our arm away from that pain. Some can cause relaxation of the skeletal muscle, and this is just an example of excitatory and inhibitory. There would be other examples, but some can cause inhibition of the skeletal muscle, causing it to relax, and we'll see when that would be important as well. So again, these spinal cord reflexes that we're going to be talking about, because again, we're looking at spinal cord and somatic nerves here. We will look more at brain and cranial nerves in another chapter. And those, we will talk about reflexes that are integrated in the brain. But these spinal cord reflexes that we're talking about, the information does not have to go to the brain to determine the response. The response is determined in the spinal cord. The three that we're going to look at: stretch reflex, Golgi tendon reflex, and the withdrawal reflex. The first one we're going to look at, the stretch reflex, is the simplest reflex. Basically, when muscle, this is going to occur when muscles contract in response to a stretching force. Okay, so basically the muscle is stretched too far. It's going to stretch this sensory receptor that we call a muscle spindle, which that should sound familiar. We did talk about this last year in regular anatomy. These are the simplest reflexes because they do not involve an interneuron. They are monosynaptic. So again, our sensory neuron is going to synapse in the spinal cord directly with a motor neuron. There will be no interneuron involved in this reflex at all. So it's going to be a very quick reflex. So basically, you have this muscle spindle is the sensory receptor in the muscle, in the skeletal muscle. It consists of 3 to 10 specialized muscle cells that respond to stretch. So if this muscle spindle is stretched too far, then this is going to allow us to it's going to cause the jerking that pulls our limb back into the correct position. Again, whenever the doctor takes a little rubber hammer and hits right under your kneecap and your leg jumps, okay, he is activating the muscle spindle in that area. Again, remember we talked about last year how when he did that, he was not checking your muscle or your bone. He's checking your nervous system to see if your nervous system has been compromised in any way. That reflex is called the knee jerk or patellar reflex. Again, that probably wouldn't be the only one. Like, you probably have one here, in your arms and things as well. But basically, this muscle spindle is innervated by these very small neurons called gamma motor neurons, and they control the sensitivity of this muscle spindle. Then you have sensory neurons that innervate the non-contractile center of the muscle spindle, and then the sensory neurons in this muscle spindle will go along that dorsal root, and they will synapse in the spinal cord with these larger motor neurons called alpha motor neurons. Now, obviously, these are going to be somatic because we're talking about moving skeletal muscle here. So these alpha motor neurons, the gamma motor neurons are little bitty neurons that are innervating the muscle spindle. The alpha motor neurons are going to be these large motor neurons that are going to be passing the information to the muscle to contract, that's going to cause the muscle to contract. So here's a picture of it. Here we can see the muscle spindle. We're going to magnify it here. So here is our muscle spindle. We have, 2 or 3 cells that are part of our muscle spindle here. And again, they detect that the muscle is being stretched. Sensory neurons, which are these green ones here, are going to send information that this muscle spindle is being stretched to the spinal cord. Okay, so we can see this green here going to the spinal cord, again going along that dorsal root into the spinal cord. Again, notice that we have no interneuron here. We are synapsing directly with our gamma and alpha motor neurons. So again, In number 3, we see that the sensory neurons, as I said, are synapsing directly with the alpha motor neuron. And then in number 4, the alpha motor neuron is sending information from that spinal cord to that skeletal muscle, telling it to contract to resist being stretched. Again, this is going to, it's trying to return that muscle to a good position, a correct position to prevent damage. Then the information also is going to be sent along this gamma motor neuron that is going to cause the muscle spindle to contract as well. This is going to maintain the proper tension in the muscle as the muscle contracts. So again, our muscle is going to contract, to prevent damage, and then this muscle spindle will also contract to keep enough tension in the muscle to also prevent damage. So we're going to be this sensory neuron is going to be synapsing with that directly with that alpha motor neuron there. Okay, the second one we're going to talk about is the Golgi tendon reflex. This prevents a contracting muscle from applying excessive tension to the tendons. So you're contracting your muscle, like you're lifting a heavy weight, for example, and then you drop that weight. Well, you don't want to keep contracting that muscle, because what you're going to do is you're going to pull against the tendon too much, and then that is going to damage the tendon, might possibly tear it or break it, which would not be good. So this Golgi tendon reflex is going to prevent a contracting muscle from keeping on contracting whenever there is excessive tension. The sensory receptor here, remember, for the stretch reflex, the sensory receptor was the muscle spindle. Here it is the Golgi tendon organ. The Golgi tendon organ is going, and I don't care about all this other stuff, but the Golgi tendon organ is a sensory receptor that's located in the tendon near the muscle. And it is going to actually synapse with inhibitory interneurons. And this is going to produce a sudden relaxation of the muscle. Again, if you keep contracting that muscle and there's too much attention being applied, you're going to damage the tendon. So this reflex is activated. And basically what it does is it doesn't cause contraction of the muscle, because the contraction of the muscle, when you already have too much tension, is going to cause damage. So it relaxes the muscle to relieve some of the tension to prevent the damage. Again, like I said, an example is a weightlifter suddenly dropping a heavy weight. So what happens is the muscle and the tendon is being stretched. This stretches the Golgi tendon organ and activates it. It sends action potentials, which is information along sensory neurons, to inhibitory interneurons in the spinal cord, and then these inhibitory interneurons will inhibit the alpha motor neurons that are innervating. That's a somatic motor neuron, again, innervating your skeletal muscle. It will secrete inhibitory neurotransmitters, and this will cause the relaxation of the muscle. So as you can see here, here's our Golgi tendon organ in the tendon associated with that muscle. What we're going to have then is we're going to have too much stretching going on here, and it's going to sense that. So it's going to send information along this sensory motor neuron, synapse with an inhibitory interneuron in the spinal cord. That inhibitory interneuron will cause this somatic motor neuron, which is an alpha motor neuron, to release inhibitory neurotransmitters, which will cause this muscle to relax, to prevent excess stretching and prevent injury to the tendon. Okay, the withdrawal reflex is probably the most complicated one of the three. It's also called the flexor reflex. What we're doing here is we're trying to remove one of your limbs or other part of your body from a painful stimulus. So what's going to happen is you're going to have a sensory receptor, for example, in your skin, that's going to detect a painful stimulus. That information, that action potential, will go along a sensory neuron to an excitatory interneuron in your spinal cord. This will cause a somatic motor neuron, that alpha motor neuron, to release excitatory neurotransmitters and cause the muscle to contract. Usually it is a flexor muscle that we are causing to contract it, and this is why it's called the flexor reflex in addition to the withdrawal reflex. Think about reaching down to touch a hot pot, or think about stepping on a tack. What do you do to get away from that? You flex. Okay, you decrease the angle at that joint to pull your arm away from the hot pot, to pull your foot away from that tack that you just stepped on. So again, usually you're contracting flexor muscles here, muscles that flex the limb. And so that's why it's called the flexor reflex. We have two different things that we're going to look at with this. First of all, we have reciprocal innervation. Basically, whenever if we're going to activate this flexor to contract so that we can flex to pull our arm away from that hot pot, then we also need to relax our extensors. Okay, we want to contract our brachialis, our brachioradialis, our biceps brachii. We want to contract those to pull our arm away. Okay, we want to relax the triceps. The triceps is an extensor. So at the same time that this reflex causes those flexors to contract, it's also going to simultaneously inhibit the extensors. It's going to cause them to relax because that is going to provide a quicker, more efficient withdrawal from that painful stimulus. So not only is this reflex going to cause alpha motor neurons that are innervating those flexors to secrete excitatory neurons, which would be excitatory neurotransmitters, which would be acetylcholine, but it's also going to have those extensor muscles to secrete inhibitory neurotransmitters. You will have branches of this interneuron that are not, it might be branches of the sensory neuron. We'll see in the picture in a minute. We'll have branches of, I think it might be the sensory neuron that are going to be also not only synapsing with excitatory interneurons to stimulate these alpha motor neurons, but also inhibitory interneurons to inhibit the alpha motor neurons going to the extensor muscles. Okay, this is also involved in the stretch reflex, which we just talked about a second ago. I thought we did. Yeah, right here. It's involved in the stretch reflex, so the jerking, okay? And what we're talking about here is if we're talking about our legs, okay? This crossed extensor reflex is only talking about our legs, okay? On the opposite side of the body, if we are going to activate our withdrawal reflex in our right leg, let's say, if we withdraw that right leg, we also need to activate the muscles in that left leg to hold us up. Because when we withdraw that right leg, if we don't activate those left leg muscles, we're going to fall down, which could produce harm. So at the same time that our right leg is stimulated to withdraw, our left leg is going to be stimulated. Those muscles will be stimulated to contract so that we can hold ourselves up with that other leg. So that's what we're talking about with the crossed extensor reflex. It occurs on the opposite side of the body from the stimulus. When the withdrawal reflex is initiated in one lower limb, then the crossed extensor reflex will be initiated in the opposite lower limb to prevent you from falling. So at the same time you are withdrawing, you're activating the muscles to contract to withdraw, let's say the right leg, then the muscles in the left leg will be activated to contract to hold you up with that left leg. Okay, so this is with reciprocal innervation. We can see here again, we have the sensory receptors in our foot. We're stepping on a tack here. So what we're doing then, that information is going along a sensory neuron to our spinal cord, and you can see here that sensory neuron is synapsing with two different things. Not only is it synapsing with excitatory neurons that are going to cause this alpha motor neuron to release excitatory neurotransmitters to cause this muscle to contract to pull our foot away from the tack, but we also see that this sensory neuron is synapsing with inhibitory neurons in the spinal cord as well to cause this alpha motor neuron to secrete inhibitory neurotransmitters to cause this extensor muscle to relax so that we can actually flex our knee here to pull our foot away from that tack, okay? So that's reciprocal. At the same time, you're stimulating your flexor muscles to contract. You're also stimulating your extensor muscles to relax. That makes for a more efficient withdrawal response. Okay, the other thing is, again, this is in a lower limb. Not only do we want to synapse with an excitatory neuron to contract the flexors, we want to relax the extensors in our, this looks like it's probably our left leg. At the same time, we also need to stimulate these muscles in our right leg to contract to hold us up when we pull this left leg away. So, not only is this sensory neuron that is giving information from this sensory receptor in our heel down there where we're stepping on the tack, not only is it synapsing with excitatory neuron or excitatory interneurons to stimulate the flexors to contract, to inhibit the extensors to get them to relax, but it's also synapsing with another excitatory interneuron to excite, to stimulate the muscles in our right leg to contract, to hold us up. So that is the crossed extensor. So crossed meaning we're stimulating both sides of the body here. Okay, last thing we want to mention, sensory information goes along ascending tracks to the brain. For example, that information for pain. So ascending is going up to the brain. So this green here, ascending. So again, information from these spinal cord reflexes, it doesn't have to go to the brain for a response. The response is initiated in the spinal cord. However, some of the information does still go to the brain, and that's what allows us to feel the pain and things like that. So sensory information from our spinal cord goes along ascending tracks to the brain, and then descending tracks from the brain, that's the purple, carry the information down the spinal cord about the reflexes. Okay, so ascending tracks, ascending is up, so going to the brain, descending coming down back to the spinal cord, letting our brain know that these reflexes are going on, that this is happening. Of course, by the time you realize you've done it, you've already done it. Okay, that is because the information for the response does not have to go to the brain. It is initiated, it is integrated right there in the spinal cord. But our brain is still aware of what's going on. But if you ever think about it, by the time you realize you've almost touched that hot pot and pulled your hand away, I mean, your hand has already been pulled away because your spinal cord integrated and initiated that response. The brain, it's kind of like the thunder coming after the lightning, okay? The lightning has already happened, then the thunder comes. Well, it's kind of this. The response has already happened by the time your brain realizes that it's happened because that information was integrated in the spinal cord, and the response was initiated in the spinal cord. You didn't have to go to the brain to get the response. Okay, so please let me know if you have any questions. Hope you have a great day. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.